Wait a minute, what is this thing, group? What is a group? Can you touch a group? Can you see a group? And it occurred to me that no, you can't. You can see individuals, you can touch individuals, but group is an abstraction. It's in the mind. It's a mathematical concept in a sense. It doesn't really exist.
One reason society has so much to offer is that we're all a little different.
If we encourage everyone on an individual level to abide by decency, then you can break the never-ending cycle of identity politics.
So which are you? Are you an I or are you a we?
We hear it all the time. Let's just treat everyone as individuals. In an age of so-called identity politics, many are proposing a focus on the individual as an antidote to social justice activism. The individualist of today styles himself as an idealization of old-school Enlightenment principles, citing the writings of John Locke, Benjamin Franklin, John Stuart Mill, and similar thinkers as their template for how political and social matters should be guided and evaluated. But in the wake of the perversion of these ideas, that form of individualism scarcely exists in the present, except maybe in the imaginations of those who fetishize it. The concept of the individual at present is more or less synonymous with the consumer, and this has had a catastrophically subversive effect on the liberal democratic ideal. What follows is a summary of Century of the Self, a documentary series examining the dramatic 20th century shift in the psychosocial paradigm and the economic, cultural, and political implications of this shift. You are, of course, encouraged to watch the documentary in full. It all starts with Sigmund Freud and his hypotheses on psychoanalysis and the nature of the inner self. Freud believed that human beings as a species and as a matter of being innately carry dark inner desires, which, if harnessed by the wrong forces, would give rise to unspeakable horrors.
The publication of Freud's works in America had an extraordinary effect on journalists and intellectuals in the 1920s. What fascinated and frightened them was the picture Freud painted of submerged, dangerous forces lurking just under the surface of modern society. Forces that could erupt easily to produce the frenzied mob which had the power to destroy even governments. It was this they believed had happened in Russia. To many, this meant that one of the guiding principles of mass democracy was wrong. The belief that human beings could be trusted to make decisions on a rational basis.
His view of humanity was essentially that man cannot be free with society, but man cannot survive without society.
What was implicit in Freud's argument was that the ideal of individual freedom, which was at the heart of democracy, was impossible. Human beings could never be allowed to truly express themselves because it was too dangerous. They must always be controlled and would thus always be discontent.
Freud had a nephew who lived in America, a man called Edward Bernays, and Bernays, unsatisfied with Freud's own hypothesis, took it a step further. Bernays believed that democracy was fundamentally flawed in that it elevated the individual desire to the level of public rule. He believed that democratic societies could only remain stable via psychological manipulation of the public, using psychoanalytic techniques to appeal to the inner desires of individuals in superficial ways, thereby keeping the public pacified under the belief that they are in control and leaving space for the ruling class to quietly direct society.
Managing the masses takes the idea of democracy and it turns it into a palliative. It turns it into giving people some kind of feel-good medication that will respond to an immediate pain or an immediate yearning, but will not alter the objective circumstances one iota.
You appeal to their desires and their unrecognized longings, that sort of thing. That you can tap into their deepest desires or their deepest fears and use that to your own purposes.
And then, in 1928, a president came to power who agreed with Bernays. President Hoover was the first politician to articulate the idea that consumerism had become the central motor of American life. After his election, he told a group of advertisers and public relations men, "You have taken over the job of creating desire and have transformed people into constantly moving happiness machines. Machines which have become the key to economic progress.
Bernays began his journey into the public consciousness through marketing. One of his earliest experiments involved convincing women to take up smoking, using a campaign he dubbed Torches of Freedom.
Men have invoked a taboo against women smoking in public. Can you do anything about that? I said, let me think about it.
A. Brill was one of the first psychoanalysts in America, and for a large fee he told Bernays that cigarettes were a symbol of the penis and of male sexual power. He told Bernays that if he could find a way to connect cigarettes with the idea of challenging male power, then women would smoke, because then they would have their own penises. Every year, New York held an Easter Day parade to which thousands came, and Bernays decided to stage an event there. He persuaded a group of rich debutantes to hide cigarettes under their clothes. Then they should join the parade, and at a given signal from him, they were to light up the cigarettes dramatically. Bernays then informed the press that he had heard that a group of suffragettes were preparing to protest by lighting up what they called torches of freedom.
He appealed to the feminist movement by characterizing smoking as a female challenge to male power. It worked. Cigarette sales amongst women spiked dramatically. Of course, he hadn't actually changed the political circumstances of women or elevated their social status in any meaningful way. He had simply made them believe it had changed, and more than that, he made them believe that they were the arbiters of that change, that they had become more powerful simply by consuming a product.
Eddie Bernays saw the way to sell product was not to sell it to your intellect, that you ought to buy an automobile, but that you will feel better about it if you have this automobile. I think he originated that idea, that they weren't just purchasing something, but they were engaging themselves, emotionally or personally, in the product or service. That it's not, you think you need a new piece of clothing, but you'll feel better with the piece of clothing. That was his contribution in a very real sense. We see it all over the place today, but I think he originated the idea of the emotional connect to a product or service.
Bernays, in essence, viewed individuals as nothing but a utility to be manipulated, with the aim of controlling larger groups of people, corralling the bewildered herd, as it were.
He didn't think about people in groups of one, thought about people in groups of thousands.
The leading political writer, Walter Lippmann, argued that if human beings were in reality driven by unconscious, irrational forces, then it was necessary to rethink democracy. What was needed was a new elite who could manage what he called the bewildered herd. This would be done through psychological techniques that would control the unconscious feelings of the masses. Edward Bernays was fascinated by Lippmann's arguments, and also saw a way to promote himself by using them. In the 1920s, he began to write a series of books which argued that he had developed the very techniques Lippmann was calling for. By stimulating people's inner desires and then sating them with consumer products, he was creating a new way to manage the irrational force of the masses. He called it the engineering of consent.
Democracy, to my father, was a wonderful concept, but I don't think he felt that all those publics out there had reliable judgment, and that they very easily might vote for the wrong man or want the wrong thing, so that they had to be guided from above. It's enlightened despotism in a sense.
And with the success of these tactics, corporations quickly took interest in Bernays' ideas.
What the corporations realized they had to do was transform the way the majority of Americans thought about products. One leading Wall Street banker, Paul Mazur of Lehman Brothers, was clear about what was necessary. We must shift America, he wrote, from a needs to a desires culture. People must be trained to desire, to want new things even before the old have been entirely consumed. We must shape a new mentality in America. Man's desires must overshadow his needs. In 1927, an American journalist wrote, "A change has come over our democracy. It is called consumptionism. The American citizen's first importance to his country is now no longer that of citizen, but that of consumer.
Bernays created a public exhibit which he dubbed Democracy, which appeared to enshrine the democratic ideal and individual self-expression. The exhibit glorified individuals as the building blocks of the public consciousness, and therefore as the true rulers of society at large. In truth, however, Bernays intended for Democracy to function as a propaganda piece. The society portrayed by the exhibit was a total inversion of his true beliefs.
In 1939, New York hosted the World's Fair. Edward Bernays was a central advisor. He insisted that the theme be the link between democracy and American business. At the heart of the fair was a giant white dome that Bernays named Democracy. And the central exhibit was a vast working model of America's future, constructed by the General Motors Corporation. The World's Fair was an extraordinary success and captured America's imagination. The vision it portrayed was of a new form of democracy, in which business responded to people's innermost desires in a way politicians could never do. But it was a form of democracy that depended on treating people not as active citizens as Roosevelt did, but as passive consumers. Because this, Bernays believed, was the key to control in a mass democracy.
Naturally, the US government also took interest in the propositions of Freud and Bernays. After World War II, American politicians became convinced that Freud was right about the unconscious danger of human nature, and it was quickly discovered that the fresh trauma of the war had awakened much older childhood stresses within the troops.
At the heart of the experiment were a number of refugee psychoanalysts from Central Europe. They worked with American psychiatrists to guide and shape the project.
When I first came to America, I worked in the psychiatric service with soldiers trying to rehabilitate them. And I traveled in the train from the East Coast to the West Coast. I was enormously curious what goes on in all of those little towns that the train is passing. I discovered the enormous role of the irrational in the lives of most people. Yeah, that I can say, that I learned that the ratio between the irrational and the rational in America is very much in favor of the irrational.
By now, Anna Freud, Sigmund Freud's daughter, had become the effective leader of the global psychoanalytic movement. And Anna, following the natural progression of her father's ideas, set out to change the functions of the mind itself. Similarly to Bernays, Anna believed that conformity could be instilled in individuals in order to keep society stable. But rather than engaging on a mass scale as Bernays did, Anna chose to focus on individual therapy, strengthening the ego through the suppression of those dangerous inner desires.
In the late 40s, a vast project began in America to apply the ideas of psychoanalysis to the masses. Psychological guidance centers were set up in hundreds of towns. They were staffed by psychiatrists who believed it was their job to control the hidden forces inside the minds of millions of ordinary Americans. Behind all this was the fundamental idea of Anna Freud's, that if people were encouraged to conform to the accepted patterns of family and social life, then their ego would be strengthened. They would be able to control the dangerous forces within them.
Meanwhile, in the corporate world, another psychoanalyst named Ernest Dichter was making further inroads with regard to the marketing of consumer goods. And he, like so many other psychoanalysts, believed that the public were fundamentally irrational, and structured his methods and aims around this starting premise.
Dichter wanted to find ways to uncover what he called the secret self of the American consumer.
He was trying to get out of people's mind the unconscious motivations that they had for purchasing. These could be sexual, they could be psychological, they could be sociological, they could be a demand for status, a demand for recognition. There were things that people couldn't verbalize or wouldn't verbalize because they were too secret to them. They were too much a part of their nature, and they would be embarrassed. They would be embarrassed if they came out and said things like this.
Dichter envisioned group therapy sessions as a means of collecting marketing data, exercises we now commonly refer to as focus groups. One fascinating discovery involved the poor market performance of instant cake mix, a product that was new to consumers at the time.
Dichter did a series of focus groups where housewives free associated about the cake mix. He concluded that they felt unconscious guilt at the new image being promoted of ease and convenience. Dichter told Betty Crocker to put an instruction on the packet that the housewife should add an egg. It would be an unconscious symbol, he said, of the housewife mixing in her own eggs as a gift to her husband, and so would lessen the guilt. Betty Crocker did it, and the sales soared.
My cake is ready.
The consumer may have basic needs that the consumer himself or herself doesn't fully understand. You have to know what those needs are in order to fully exploit the consumer.
Dichter, like Bernays, essentially believed that individuals could define and express themselves through consumption of products.
Dichter's success led to a rush by corporations and advertising agencies to employ psychoanalysts. They became known as the Depth Boys, and they promised to show companies how to make millions by connecting their products with people's hidden desires. But Dichter was convinced that this was far more than just selling. Like Anna Freud, he believed that the environment could be used to strengthen the human personality. And products have the power both to sate inner desires and give people a feeling of common identity with those around them. It was a strategy for creating a stable society. Dichter called it the strategy of desire.
To understand a stable citizen, you have to know that modern man quite often tries to work off his frustrations by spending on self-gratification. Modern man is eternally ready to fill out his self-image by purchasing products which complement it.
These techniques even influenced the sale of foreign policy to the public. Edward Bernays, now employed by the CIA, created a fraudulent news agency in order to publicize the claim that the Soviet Union was planning to use Guatemala as a proxy to attack the United States. This propaganda campaign successfully convinced the public, with little evidence, that American intervention was necessary.
Working with the United Fruit Company, the CIA trained and armed a rebel army, and found a new leader for the country called Colonel Armas. As planes flown by CIA pilots dropped bombs on Guatemala City, Edward Bernays carried on his propaganda campaign in the American press. He was preparing the American population to see this as the liberation of Guatemala by freedom fighters for democracy.
He totally understood that the coup would happen when the public and the press, when conditions in the public and the press allowed for a coup to happen, and he created those conditions. He was totally savvy in terms of just what he was helping create there in terms of this overthrow. But ultimately he was reshaping reality, reshaping public opinion in a way that's undemocratic and manipulative.
Within months, Vice President Nixon visited Guatemala. In an event staged by United Fruit's PR department, he was shown piles of Marxist literature that had been found, it was said, in the presidential palace.
This is the first time in the history of the world that the communist government has been overthrown by the people.
Impressed with the success of these tactics, and hearing rumblings of similar Soviet experimentation, the CIA began pouring millions of dollars into research universities across the country, with the aim of creating an ultimate means of psychological control.
The most notorious of these experiments was run by the head of the American Psychiatric Association, Dr. Ewan Cameron. Like many psychiatrists at that time, Cameron was convinced that inside human beings were dangerous forces which threatened society. But he believed that it was possible not just to control these forces, but actually remove them. Cameron had set up a clinic in a hospital in Montreal called the Allen Memorial. It is now long since closed down. Cameron took patients who suffered a wide range of mental problems. His theory was that these resulted from forgotten or repressed memories. But he was impatient with the idea of using psychotherapy to uncover them. Instead, he would simply wipe them. Cameron used drugs, including LSD, and the technique of ECT, electroconvulsive therapy.
He was really using it to try and change the fundamental function of the individual, to alter their past memories, their past ways of behaving, and as I think he said at one point, it is to just sort of erase everything from their past, so that you then had a slate in which you could record new ways of behavior. And then having depatterned somebody or brought them down to where basically nothing but the essential functions of the body were going on in terms of breathing and things of this nature, then he would begin to feed material into these individuals, positive material, such that the brain would be programmed in a positive way, so that the individual would be completely altered.
In fact, Cameron's experiments were a complete disaster. All he managed to produce were dozens of individuals with memory loss, and the ability to repeat the phrase, "I am at ease with myself." And it was not an isolated case. Almost all the experiments the CIA funded were equally unsuccessful.
Psychoanalysis was about to receive a severe blow to its credibility in the corporate and government worlds. Anna Freud's endeavors to instill conformity on an individual basis, including in Hollywood stars, were not going as well as she had hoped.
The film industry had become fascinated by psychoanalysis, and Anna Freud was a powerful influence on dozens of analysts in Los Angeles. They treated film stars, directors, and studio bosses. Anna Freud's closest friend was the most sought after of all, Ralph Greenson. And in 1960, the most famous star in the world turned to Greenson for help. Marilyn Monroe was suffering from despair and had become addicted to alcohol and drugs. But despite all his efforts, Greenson was unable to help Marilyn Monroe. On August 5th, 1962, she committed suicide in her house. The suicide shocked many in the analytic community, including Anna Freud. And high-profile figures in American life, who had previously been enthusiasts for psychoanalysis, now began to question why psychoanalysis had become so powerful in America.
Although these strategies had proven effective as marketing techniques, they had seemingly been taken too far in these other regards, and so public intellectuals became suspicious of the practice of psychoanalysis. Enter Herbert Marcuse. An associate of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, Marcuse sought to invert the notions of Bernays and of Sigmund and Anna Freud. The source of human evil, in Marcuse's view, lay at the societal level, in social norms and standards of conformity, rather than the inner desires of the individual.
It was one of the most striking phenomena to see to what extent the ruling power structure could manipulate, manage and control not only the consciousness but also the subconscious and unconscious of the individuals. And this took place on a psychological basis by the controls and the manipulation of the unconscious primary drives which Freud stipulated.
Marcuse fostered a student rebellion of self-evaluation. University students were encouraged to look within themselves and deconstruct the social norms and controls that, according to Marcuse, had been implanted there by society, by the corporations and the government.
Following the logic of Marcuse's argument, the new student left set out to attack this system of social control. It was summed up in the slogan, "There is a policeman inside all our heads. He must be destroyed." And that policeman was going to be destroyed by overthrowing the state and the corporations that had put him there. One group, the Weathermen, began a series of bomb attacks on companies that they said both controlled people's minds through consumer products and made the weapons being used in Vietnam.
There's no way to be committed to nonviolence in the middle of the most violent society that history's ever created.
But the American state fought back violently. At the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968, the police and the National Guard were unleashed to attack thousands of demonstrators. It was the start of a phase of ruthless repression of the New Left in America. Confronted by this violent repression, many in the New Left began to turn to a new idea. If it was impossible to get the policeman out of one's head by overthrowing the state, instead one should find a way of getting inside one's own mind and removing the controls implanted there by the state and the corporations. Out of this would come a new self, and thus a new society.
Alongside this protest movement, a psychotherapist named Fritz Perl was hosting group therapy sessions, coaching participants to express the inner desires and feelings that society had taught them were dangerous.
To produce the new self, they turned to the ideas and techniques of Wilhelm Reich. Since his death, a small group of psychotherapists have been developing techniques based on Reich's ideas. Their aim was to invent ways that would allow individuals to free themselves from the controls implanted in their minds by society. Their center was a tiny old motel on the remote coast of California. It was called the Esalen Institute.
It's a basic fear of that thing inside me, like a little demon in there. It doesn't come out very often. It's really hard to get it out.
Now put the thing inside you on that chair, talk to it.
Pearls used to call this getting on the hot seat in front of a group. If this were the hot seat and you were Pearls, and you would guide me into this process of self-enactment, self-revelation, of staying present to all the parts of yourself and noticing it, and then taking ownership of this.
As the demon?
Yeah.
Yes, I can come out. I can come right out of him, and I can push him aside. So that
you, say you.
I can push you aside.
Yeah. Be the demon with each one of us.
I can make you all cry. I can make you all feel terrible. Maybe even forever. I can make this mouth here, do things and say things. I can almost destroy anyone, each one of you, if I get out.
As the Esalen Institute became more popular, a broader movement had formed around this subculture of self-exploration, the human potential movement.
So it became magnetic. People wanted to join this stream of exploration. Within 7 or 8 years, there were about 200 of these centers in America, looking mainly to Esalen for the leadership.
I feel so liberated.
Really? It's fantastic.
And it took on a big political agenda. You could not separate personal transformation from social transformation. The two go together.
As the movement grew, the leaders of Esalen decided to try and use their techniques to solve social problems. They began with racism. They organized an encounter group for white and black radicals. Both groups would be encouraged to express their inner racist feelings which had been instilled in them by society. By doing this, they would transcend those feelings and encounter each other as individuals.
I started a series of encounters called Racial Confrontation as Transcendental Experience. We thought that we wanted to get that kind of black-white confrontation so you could really get down to see what was between the two races, not by backing off and trying to be polite, but by going right into the belly of the beast, of this beast of racial prejudice. And these were extremely dramatic. These were the toughest workshops ever convened at Esalen Institute.
I'm looking at you, Whitey. You got clothes on. You got shoes on.
You're so sure looking at me, huh?
You got the goddamn police in the neighborhood.
Really? They're not my police.
You got a governor. You got a mayor.
Oh, really?
You got the president. You got ambassadors.
You can vote, too.
You got debts in Vietnam. That's the benefits of slave labor. You got buildings, skyscrapers that you dominate and control economically and politically. And tell me that it's not yours.
It's yours, too.
The black-white encounter groups were a disaster. The black radicals saw it as an insidious attempt to destroy their power. By trying to turn them into liberated individuals, Esalen was removing the one thing that gave them power and confidence in their struggle against racism, their collective identity as blacks.
For my reason. For your reason. Now dig this. Your reason for being here is different from my reason.
So the human potential movement turned to another social group who they believed would benefit from personal transformation. Nuns. And this time they were more successful.
One of the things we unleashed was sexual energy. The kind of thing that the church had been very good at restraining was no longer to be restrained. One sister who was a member of the community, she got the idea that she could be freer than she had been before, and she seduced one of her classmates and then seduced the mistress of novices, who was an older woman very reserved, and her program of freeing this older woman was sexual.
As the 1960s came to a close, encounter groups had become a popular countercultural force, breaking down various collective identities until only the individual whims of the participants remained. The bottom line of corporate America began to suffer as a result.
The life insurance business, more than any other business at the time, was built on the Protestant ethic. You only bought life insurance if you were a person who sacrificed for the future. The conventional interpretation, the dominant interpretation, was that it had to do with political radicalism. But, you know, it was clear to us that that was a mask, a cover. The core of it had to do with self-expressiveness. That this preoccupation with the self and the inner self, that was what was so important to people.
The subculture of nonconformity continued to grow, accelerated by an entrepreneur named Werner Erhard, who created a larger-scale version of the encounter groups.
Erhard had invented a system called EST, Erhard Seminar Training. Hundreds of people came for weekend sessions to be taught how to be themselves. And EST was soon copied by other groups, like Exegesis in Britain. Many of Erhard's techniques came from the human potential movement, but he criticised the movement for not having gone far enough. Their idea that there was a central core inside all human beings was, he said, just another limitation on human freedom. In reality, there was no fixed self, which meant that you could be anything that you wanted to be.
The thesis of the human potential movement was that there was something really good down in there. And if you took these layers off, what you were going to wind up with was a kernel, a something that was innately self-expressive, that was the true self, that was going to be a wonderful thing. In actuality, you found people who'd gone to the last layer and took off the last layer and found that what was left was nothing.
All right, push! Move! Do it!
The EST sessions were intense and often brutal. The participants signed contracts agreeing not to leave and to allow the trainers to do anything they thought necessary to break down their socially constructed identities.
The real point to the EST training was to go down through layer after layer after layer after layer until you got to the last layer and peeled it off, where the recognition was that it's really all meaningless and empty. Now, that's existentialism's endpoint. EST went a step further in that people began to recognize that it was not only meaningless and empty, but it was empty and meaningless that it was empty and meaningless.
What Erhard did was to say that only the individual matters, that there is no societal concern.
The political motivation for the human potential movement had been almost entirely forgotten by this point. The new individualism had moved far beyond the legalistic concepts expressed by John Locke, Ben Franklin, and John Stuart Mill. Now, the idea that one must be oneself permeated the broader American culture.
In 1970, it was a small percentage of the total population, maybe 3 to 5%. By 1980, it had spread to the vast majority of the public, up to 80%.
Marketers needed to find a way to appeal to the new individual, a way to get inside their heads. The Stanford Research Institute, one of the most significant research facilities in the United States, set out to solve the problem.
In 1978, a group of economists and psychologists at SRI decided to find a way to read, measure, and fulfill the desires of these new, unpredictable consumers. To do this, SRI turned for help to those who had begun the liberation of the self. In particular, one of the leaders of the human potential movement, a psychologist called Abraham Maslow. Through observing the work at places like Esalen, Maslow had invented a new system of psychological types. He called it the hierarchy of needs, and it described the different emotional stages that people went through as they liberated their feelings. At the top was self-actualization. This was the point at which individuals became completely self-directed and free of society. The team at SRI thought that Maslow's hierarchy might form the basis for a new way to categorize society, not by social class, but by different psychological desires and drives. To test this, they designed a huge questionnaire with hundreds of questions about how people saw themselves, their inner values. The questions were designed to see whether people fitted into Maslow's categories. The answers were then analysed by a computer. It revealed that there were underlying patterns in the way people felt about themselves, which fitted Maslow's categories. And at the top of the hierarchy were a large and growing group which cut across all social classes. The SRI team called them the inner directives. These were people who felt they were not defined by their place in society, but by the choices they made themselves. But what SRI discovered was that these people could be defined by the different patterns of behaviour through which they chose to express themselves. Self-expression was not infinite. It fell into identifiable types. And the SRI team invented a new term for it: lifestyles. They had managed to categorize the new individualism. They called their system Values and Lifestyles, VALS for short.
Values and lifestyles testing would become the gold standard for the marketing of products. As manufacturing technology and computing power improved, it became more feasible to create short runs of more unique products and market these products according to the various personality types recognized by the VALS model. The 20th century psychology of the individual had come full circle. Freudian thinkers like Edward Bernays viewed the inner self as dangerous and in need of manipulation and suppression. The later New Left thinkers of the 60s and 70s like Herbert Marcuse, Fritz Perl, Werner Erhard, and Abraham Maslow inverted this idea, and instead saw the societal imposition of normative behaviors as the true source of evil, placing the elevation of the inner self as the best way to change society. But this view of self-actualization and the performative self had been successfully co-opted by the same consumerist institutions that the New Left had rebelled against. In essence, the 1960s New Left movement had completely backfired. An entire industry of psychological marketing techniques arose from the New Left's devotion to self-love and individual whims.
The original idea had been that the liberation of the self would create new kinds of people, free of social constraint. That radical change had happened. But while the new beings felt liberated, they had become increasingly dependent for their identity on business. The corporations had realized that it was in their interests to encourage people to feel that they were unique individuals and then offer them ways to express that individuality.
But values and lifestyles testing wouldn't end with the marketing of products. Ronald Reagan's 1980 presidential campaign heavily appealed to the individual in a way that was, at the time, considered radical by the political establishment. The rhetoric of individualism and government non-intervention strongly appealed to the inner directives, and this strategy of treating political campaigns like marketing campaigns ultimately led to a decisive victory for Reagan. Political campaigns, like consumer marketing, had become fixated on the specific, highly individuated desires of the public.
And I vision leadership in taking government off your backs and turning you loose to do what you can do so well. Thank you very much.
The idea that the new self-actualizing individuals would choose a politician from the right, not the left, seemed extraordinary. But to test their prediction, the Values and Lifestyles team did a survey of voting intentions, and they correlated it with their new psychological categories.
Margaret Thatcher employed a similar approach to that of Ronald Reagan and appealed to the will of the inner directives, the highly actualized members of the public. The Labour Party quickly realized that they too would have to appeal to the new individualism.
For they are the party of yesterday, and tomorrow is ours.
In the face of this, a growing number within the Labour Party became convinced that if they were ever to regain power, Labour would have to come to terms with the new individualism. One of them was an advertising executive called Philip Gould, who had been a lifelong Labour supporter.
Labour stopped listening to these people. And I remember the best example of this was after the election of 1983, which was the election above all where the people's voices just were not heard.
But Labour Party leader John Smith refused to adopt Gould's focus group strategy and paid for it in the elections. Gould left Britain and went to work on Bill Clinton's campaign in the United States, where the results showed in Clinton's campaign rhetoric.
I'm not going to raise taxes on the middle class. And the middle class needs a break. Government is in the way.
Clinton campaigned on an appeal to the highly individualistic swing voters, but upon his election, his team realized there was a problem.
At a meeting in the White House in January 1993, the head of the Federal Reserve told them that the deficit was nearly $300 billion. There was no way they could borrow any more without panicking the markets and causing a crisis. The only way to pay for the proposed tax cuts would be to cut government spending, not just on defence, but on welfare. Clinton was faced with a choice between the old politics and the new, and he chose the old. The tax cuts were dropped, and he tried to inspire the country with the old democratic ideal of government spending to help the poor and disadvantaged.
Tonight I want to talk with you about what government can do, because I believe government must do more. Government is in the way. Government must do more.
The swing voters he had appealed to viewed this as a betrayal of his campaign promises, and the Republicans won big in the following midterm elections. Electoral politics had transitioned to a reliance on the highly individuated desires of swing voters. The political establishment began to treat them like consumers. Democracy had now devolved into obsession with minute, highly specific issues, intended as marketing tools to gain political power and not much else.
They got to the president, shaped the president's mind, were those who viewed the voters as just a collection of individual desires that had to be catered to and pandered to. It suggests that democracy is nothing more, and should be nothing more, than pandering to these unthought about, very primitive desires. Primitive in the sense that they are not even necessarily conscious.
In fact, when the Labour Party in Britain finally did adopt this marketing strategy, they too had to crucify their own platform in order to cater to swing voters. It all goes back to Edward Bernay's propaganda piece, Democracy.
This was the model of democracy that both New Labour and the American Democrats had bought into in order to regain power. They had used techniques developed by business to read the desires of consumers, and they had accepted Bernay's claim that this was a better form of democracy. But in reality, the World's Fair had been an elaborate piece of propaganda designed by Bernays for his clients, the giant American corporations. Privately, Bernays did not believe that true democracy could ever work. He had been profoundly influenced in this by his uncle's theories of human nature. Freud believed that individuals were not driven by rational thought, but by primitive, unconscious desires and feelings. And Bernays believed that this meant it was too dangerous to let the masses ever have control over their own lives. And consumerism was a way of giving people the illusion of control, while allowing a responsible elite to continue managing society.
It's not that the people are in charge, but that the people's desires are in charge. The people are not in charge. The people exercise no decision-making power within this environment. So democracy is reduced from something which assumes an active citizenry to something which now increasingly is predicated on the idea of the public as passive consumers, the public as people who essentially what you're delivering them are doggy treats.
The problem for New Labour was that it believed the propaganda. They took at face value the idea promoted by business that the systems invented to read the consumer's mind could form the basis for a new type of democracy. Once in power, New Labour tried to govern through a system that Philip Gould called continuous democracy. But what worked for business in designing products led the Labour government into a bewildering maze of contradictory whims and desires. For much of Labour's first term, the focus groups said that the railways were not a high priority, and Labour's policies faithfully reflected this. But now, those same groups are blaming the government for not having invested more money sooner in the railways.
The point about focus group politics is that there isn't one because people are contradictory and irrational, and so you have a problem in terms of deciding what you're going to do if all you do is actually listen to a mass of individual opinions that are forever fluctuating and don't really have any coherence, and crucially are not set in context. So that's why people can say, I want lower taxes and better public services. Of course they do.
The result of all this is a system in which politicians can rely on this strategy as a crutch to gain and maintain power. In this perverse fashion, they use the individual desires of the public, sustaining their careers on promises they cannot possibly keep and principles they cannot possibly adhere to, a personal self-serving desire unto itself. The notion that you are a rational arbiter at the helm of society is, to the political class, nothing more than a measuring stick with which to gain power.
Politics must be more than that. Politics and leadership are about engaging the public in a rational discussion and deliberation about what is best, and treating people with respect in terms of their rational abilities to debate.
Reich's assertion that politics can and should be rational remains to be seen. Humans are, after all, still just animals. The individualism of today is no longer recognizable as the Enlightenment liberalism of Locke, Franklin, and Mill. The observations and methods of the psychotherapists, advertisers, economists, and political strategists featured in Century of the Self seem to suggest that even the most individualistic, most self-actualized people are more easily pressured and controlled than they are willing or able to consciously realize. It's worth noting that psychological techniques alone were not enough for this dramatic shift to occur. Technology interacted with and reinforced these techniques every step of the way. The expression, "the medium is the message," comes to mind, that being the concept that the very medium by which a message is conveyed creates a kind of synergy with the message itself. In other words, the perception of a message has a sort of symbiotic relationship with the way that message is delivered. The most obvious example for our purposes is the ubiquity of television and its accompaniment of the rise of psychoanalysis. The television didn't just transmit an advertisement, it transmitted it directly into the viewer's home, complete with moving images and relatable human faces, a fundamentally different method of delivery from that of the radio or the billboard. But what the Century of the Self could not have accounted for at the time of its publication in 2002 was the oncoming explosion of the internet as an advertising platform. The internet is the ultimate encapsulation of the phrase, "the medium is the message." Content providers and social networks observe and manipulate trends to influence the thoughts and even emotions of their users, and these appeals are piped directly into our smartphones, devices which are arguably more personal to us than any other invention. We contact our loved ones with them, we take photos with them, we get much of our knowledge and entertainment from them, and so the inverse is that they are the windows through which marketers are able to peer inside our minds. In the present environment, the inner desires of the individual are not only appealed to, but monitored to a degree that Edward Bernays likely couldn't have imagined in the formulation of his original idea. We are thoroughly bathed in constant hyper-awareness of the self. All of the social forces that once interacted with our inner desires and shaped our concept of the self have been discouraged and deconstructed in favor of a fixation on purely individual whims. Outwardly originated and recognized senses of self-identity, be they national, ethnic, cultural, religious, linguistic, communal, or societal, have been cast aside in favor of the worship of the isolated self, a sort of hyper-individualism. Instead of identifying with those around us as part of something greater than ourselves, we now identify with superficial personal preferences. We identify as gamers, fans of TV shows, as styles of dress, and as members of political parties. This lack of a substantive, organic foundation for the self is precisely why we have seen a resurgence of so-called identity politics. Human beings are social animals who crave belonging that consumerism and focus group politics cannot adequately provide. To wade into the deeper waters of heritage, culture, or community would be to sin against the status quo. So all of this raises a burning question. How can individualism be the solution to any of our present problems when it has, apparently, already been taken to its fullest extent and turned into an instrument of psychological manipulation? The original vision of Edward Bernays has already been realized. It's the dominant paradigm of our age, a belief that has held sway for less than a century. And it means that no, you are not really in control, no matter how much you would like to believe you are. And it seems that this complacent worship of the inner self can only serve as a glaring weak point when confronted by those who haven't adopted this frame of mind.